In the book The Big Switch, Nicholas Carr outlines how 100 years ago, companies stopped producing their own power with steam engines and plugged into the newly built electric grid. The cheap power pumped out by electric utilities not only changed how businesses operated, but also brought the modern world into existence. Today, a similar revolution is underway. Companies are dismantling their private computer systems and tapping into rich services delivered over the internet. This time, it's computing that's turning into a utility. The shift is already remaking the computer industry, bringing new competitors like Google to the fore and threatening traditional stalwarts like Microsoft and Dell. But the effects will reach much further. Cheap computing will ultimately change society as profoundly as cheap electricity did. Companies have always used technology. The question was, what type of technology and how was it used? To understand the business implications of cloud computing and the potential the future holds, look back to the 1850s and the introduction of Burtons Wheel, the most powerful vertical water wheel in history. Back then, business owners knew if you were going to be in business, you also had to produce your own power to remain competitive. There was no need to be in business if you could not harness energy to help become more productive. What is unique about Henry Burton is he realized if he could do a better job at generating power, he could gain a competitive advantage in his market. So he invented the Burton Wheel to power his factory. The Burton Wheel was arguably the most singular and spectacular feature of an era that abounded with significant technological innovation. The invention and use of the giant Burton Wheel made his company a market leader for many decades. However, by 1920, this once dominant and strategic asset could be seen rusting in the field. What happened? Did his company go out of business? No, there was a fundamental change in the assumption of how to produce power. Around that time, George Westinghouse created the first centralized alternating power plant for mass consumption designed after the Tesla power generating plants. All of a sudden, a fundamental assumption about business was changing. No longer did a business owner need to invest large amounts of capital to buy or build a dedicated power generation station. Centralized alternating power introduced a more efficient model to acquire power. Centralized production of alternating power over a distributed network was a disruptive technology that changed the world. In 1900, this leap from self-generated power to a distributed mass consumption network was risky. Businesses had significant investment in not only the wheels but the apparatuses to distribute the power throughout the plants. These were the business systems of the time. Most companies had proprietary distribution systems to power their plants. Also, there was a big investment in a large staff to support the infrastructure. Think about it. Companies had to not only hire the expertise to design and run the power distribution network, they had to select the right type of hardware, make sure it was large enough to meet maximum demand cycles, and ensure connectivity and uptime. This was the only way to get power until the centralized utility companies came along. Buying from a utility company was cheaper and more flexible but required change. Obviously, companies did abandon the old models and make the change. In the 1930s and 40s, there was almost an entire shift to using centralized utility plants for power. This was an enormous change in business assumptions and strategy. Carr espouses the same thing is now happening in information technology. IT is as arguably as important to business today as electricity was in the early 1900s. While the solutions are different, they are both general-purpose technologies. If you can find a way to centralize the supply of a general-purpose technology and allow it to be shared rather than force companies to invest in individual and proprietary systems, you can save enormous amounts of money and free up enormous capital to allow companies to invest in their core business. Looking back at the history of IT, early on the assumption was companies needed to run their own computers and software. This was common through the 1960s. This was the prevailing model of the mainframe era where the power of computing was hidden inside the computer. There were clean rooms and teams of people running the data center. But the problem was the power of the computer could not be fully realized. The machines were generally used for corporate or high-level purposes. Individual end users were still isolated from the true power of the computer. Mainframe utilization as an asset was high, but it came at a cost: lack of simple end-user accessibility. With the growth of personal computers, companies began developing internal server rooms. Client-server networks enabled the end user to harness the capabilities of computing, which exploded the power of computing. By the 1990s, this was a mirror image of the old mainframe era. On the one hand, computing had become very personal. On the other hand, there are enormous inefficiencies. Unfortunately, the high utilization of mainframes went away and other inefficiencies were built in as individual companies began developing these high-capacity server rooms. With most server architecture designs, there is wasted processing space, storage capacity, and capital. For example, a recent study by HP found only 20% of corporate servers are utilized. versus the 80% of mainframes, and only 35% of network storage capacity is consumed. With in-house proprietary server systems, it is estimated 70% of IT labor costs are driven by routine maintenance activities. If you think about it, if companies are basically doing the same things with IT and spending so much money on maintaining the status quo, IT capabilities quickly become indistinguishable and companies lose their IT competitive advantage. At that point, IT becomes more a cost of doing business rather than a competitive advantage. What can companies do to improve IT utilization and free up capital? The answer: cloud computing. No longer do you need to go to the electronics store to buy software, make sure it is compatible with your operating system, and determine if you have enough memory. This can all be done on the web. The cloud makes it easier to change business models, try new things, and create differentiation. Cloud computing is the new disruptive technology. The question is, will you be a disruptor or one of the disrupted? To get a complimentary copy of The Big Switch and learn more about HighJump's hosting and managed services, contact Chris Barnes at +1 770 331 3908 or chris.barnes@highjump.com.